Hi everyone, so October is upon us and that felt like the ideal month to do a video I've been meaning to do for a while, which is my top 10 horror books. So I have to say, more than any other genre really, apart from maybe romance, I feel that horror is something that is so unique to the individual and their tastes. And for that reason, if you don't see your favourite horror author on this list, like Stephen King, then please, no hard feelings, each to their own. These are my favourite horror stories and I certainly am drawn to very specific things when it comes to creepy, when it comes to horror, when it comes to mystery and suspense. And I do love something eerie. I love something that potentially has a little bit of the paranormal or the ghostly, but that it isn't necessarily clear. I love the kind of horror where you don't know exactly what's going on, but it feels like there's something in the corner of the room or something peering over your shoulder that's always lurking and may jump out at any moment. I also love lyrical prose when it comes to my horror. I love vivid imagery. I'm not necessarily into like super gory violence, serial killer, contemporary horror in that respect. But then again, at the same time, there's definitely a diverse selection here. There's a few different types of horror, different levels of frightening, that's for sure, and obviously we all find different things frightening at that. So I also have some YA and some adult. I did debate including some children/middle grade sort of horror books, but that felt like it might be pushing the boundaries of frightening slightly. So like I said, I've stuck with YA and adult and these are my 10 personal favourites in this sort of quite wide and expansive genres. So hopefully this video will provide you with both some Halloween and year-round recommendations, and of course please let me know what your favourite horror novels are in the description box down below, especially if you think that they will appeal to me based on what I've talked about in this video. So without further ado, let's crack on with the books. So I'm not going to go in any particular order, but I have to say that the horror novel that has possibly caused me the most nightmares is 100% The Beauty by Elia Whiteley. So Elia Whiteley is a surrealist, speculative author who writes a lot of horror both in sort of novella, novel and in short story format, and I have to say her short stories are also terrifyingly creepy, but if I was going to pick one piece of her literature to include in this video, it had to be The Beauty. So The Beauty is set in a futuristic dystopian world. The last of womankind have died out, which also means the end of the human race, and we follow a small community of men who live off the land in a small community and tell each other stories around the fire in the evening, accepting that they are the last of the human race, and as they die out, so too will their species. However, what truly initiates the storyline of this novella is when the graves of the last women of their community who passed away start to grow mushrooms. So from the soil where these women's dead bodies lie, their bones lie, these fungus and these mushrooms start to grow and they get bigger and bigger and seem more and more sentient, and I don't think I can say any more because one of the real crux of reading a horror novel is suspense and not knowing what's going to happen. So that's your initial premise. If you have a mushroom phobia, probably don't read this book. If you don't have a mushroom phobia, it might give you one. I genuinely had nightmares reading this book, and I think that's also to do with Elia Whiteley's writing. Like, Elia Whiteley is such a stunning writer. Her writing is so evocative, and although she was writing about the most gruesome, awful subject matter, she wrote about it in such a beautiful way that it was completely captivating and all the more horrific for it. If I remember, I will link below some of her short story collections as well because those are also terrifying and unnerving. The next one I want to mention isn't one that I necessarily found like heart-poundingly frightening, but it's definitely a classic and I think very representative of what I'm drawn to in my more creepy, ghostly horror novels, and that is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. So I think Shirley Jackson is another one of those just gorgeous writers. She was popular in the 1950s and 1960s, and she wrote a few sort of mind-boggling, mysterious and sometimes horror stories, and this is probably the one that falls most firmly into the horror category. I think the title of this one gives it away, The Haunting of Hill House. This one is about the possibility of a haunting, and the premise of the story is that a group of people have been brought together for what is basically like a scientific study. each of the people brought together in this house has had a paranormal, otherworldly, ghostly experience at some point in their life. So they claim to have seen a ghost, have interacted with a ghost, for something ghostly to have happened to them, and this scientist has decided to bring them all together in this house that is supposedly haunted in itself, and see what happens when you bring together a group of people that have supposedly already experienced paranormal activity in a house that is supposedly full of paranormal activity. Will we witness more? Will they experience more as a group? What will happen? And we follow one of these people, a young woman who, like I said, supposedly experienced a paranormal sighting and experience when she was younger, as she sort of is drawn into this house and the different characters in this house and the secrets that people might be keeping, and whether she is really aware of exactly what's going on. Is this claustrophobic atmosphere simply just playing with her head, or is there something supernatural in this house? I will say there is a Netflix adaptation of this book, which you may have heard of, but they are very, very different. So whether you liked or didn't like the Netflix adaptation, I would consider this separately and go into it with a very open mind, because like I said, they are very, very different. But I think Shirley Jackson is a fantastic writer. There's so much suspense and claustrophobia and intrigue and eeriness to this book that I just love it. I think there's also something particularly absorbing about a haunted house, about a creepy manor, about a claustrophobic environment like that I know a lot of horror writers focus on and a lot of us are drawn to. So I will mention the two other books I would say fall under that category now whilst it's on my mind. And the next one is White is for Witching by Helen Oyeyemi. To be honest, I really need to get myself a physical copy of this book, because I always mention it in videos all the time and never obviously have a physical copy to show you, but I read it on my Kindle, so that's why. I adore this book though. Again, Oyeyemi is just a phenomenal writer, so her writing, whatever form it takes, in my experience, is always beautiful. She also often focuses on the speculative and the magic realism. So we have a sort of mundane everyday setting in most of her books, including this one, but with something potentially otherworldly, magical or creepy in the background that isn't quite right and isn't quite as you'd expect. In this instance, of course, we have a bit of a haunted house, or a magical, possessed, creepy house. We follow a family where each generation of the women in this family is supposedly a witch. It's something a little bit more natural and everyday, and each generation of this family has also lived in this house that has belonged to them throughout their ancestry, and because of that the house seems to have absorbed a lot of this magic, or else the house is the source of the magic, or else this is all some weird hallucination, and it is narrating the story. So the house is watching the residents inside of itself and narrating it, and it becomes incredibly possessive of the female members of this family and the women, and we're following the most recent of this young woman who is just going off to university to study for the first time, who's falling in love with another young woman for the first time, who's experiencing all that tumult and dealing with her own compulsion to eat things that are not food, like cotton wool or chalk. And that's all happening whilst this house is watching it all, and the house is so creepy. I love the concept of the house as the narrator. I think that's so unique and works so well if you're looking for something beautiful but unnerving, and I love this book. We then have one that is quite a recent read for me, and that is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and there is so much to love about this book. This one very much is in the vein of sort of mid 20th century Gothic inspired literature. Obviously Gothic is a genre that predates the mid 20th century, but I feel like there's also like an era of literature in that time as well that harkens back to that genre, and then this harkens back to those. So for example, this really gives me Shirley Jackson or Daphne du Maurier vibes, but definitely on the horror end of the spectrum. I think although Daphne du Maurier is a little bit unnerving and unsettling, it's certainly not what I would describe as horror, whereas this I would. And it's set in 1950s Mexico, so again harkening back to that kind of mid 20th century Gothic style literature. And we follow a young woman whose cousin, who was as close to her as a sister growing up, has recently been married, but she's received some unsettling letters from her cousin about her home, which is in rural Mexico in this secluded manor house, and her husband, who may not be as nice as she had hoped or first suspected. So she goes to visit her cousin to see what's going on, to see how her cousin is doing, whether she's potentially ill or her husband is mistreating her, and of course ends up being dragged into some unsavoury situations, discovering some unsettling secrets, and honestly trying to guess where this book is going to go is such a roller coaster of an adventure. It twists and it turns and you come up with these and you speculate and you may guess where it's going at some point, but I think it certainly takes a while, and if you're like me, who's somebody who's not really that great at predicting where books are going to end up, then you won't. And I really liked that, and I thought it was full of surprises and had me on tenterhooks throughout, and felt like the stakes were real and high and like anything could happen, but at the same time I loved our feisty protagonist. I loved her inquisitive nature and her powerful personality and the way she interacted with all the other characters, and I felt so invested and in love really with her and a few of the other like side characters. So this one was excellent and I can't wait to read more by this author. Talking about high stakes, my next book is actually a YA novel, but that does not mean it is any lower stakes than any other horror. This is honestly one of the most high stakes horror books I've ever read, to be perfectly honest, and that is Rules for Vanishing by Kate Alice Marshall. This one is also like fast paced, intriguing, fun, action-packed, because I think it's YA, but at the same time it is dark, it is gory, it is gruesome, it is high stakes, it is like unsettling, unnerving, and this is another one that definitely gave me nightmares. I had to stop reading this one in the evenings because I couldn't sleep. I've said it once and I'll say it again, we all have different tolerances to horror and what necessarily creeps us out, so it might not give you nightmares, but it gave me nightmares, yet I could not stop reading it. I had to know what was going to happen, despite the fact that around every corner it seemed to be something horrific. And this is about a group of teenagers, one of which went missing a year earlier. So two of the teenagers in this group are sisters, they're adopted sisters, and the adopted sister went missing a year previously. It's now a year on, as you would expect from the timeline. And our friends have gathered together to participate in this game. So it's a game stemming from a legend in their hometown where there's supposedly this road in the woods, and if you follow this road then you may be led to where this other young girl went missing, I think like decades ago, if not like a century previously. So we have a girl that went missing a century ago, we have a girl that went missing a year ago, we have a mysterious magical road involved in some dark games that ends up trapping them on a paranormal otherworldly journey, and on top of this you also have a little bit of flitting back and forward in the timeline to the present where our main characters are being interviewed by paranormal specialists. You also have like various found documents in the style of sort of like the Blair Witch, you know, you've got like text exchanges, etc, that help piece together what happened, because maybe everybody's memory isn't quite what it's supposed to be. And honestly, like, this was a book that just had me captivated from beginning to end, and like I said, nightmares, but still couldn't put it down, so really enjoyed it. I take back my earlier statement about haunted house books because I actually have a fourth one, although it's not technically like a novel, it's actually a comic book series or a graphic novel series, and that is the Lock and Key series. This is one of the few comic book series I've actually read from beginning to end. So many comic book series go on for such a long time that I end up dwindling off in interest. I'll maybe read like 4 bind-ups and then never get any further, but Lock and Key is one that I've actually read from beginning to end, and that is a marker of how good it was, how well paced it was, and how it managed to capture my attention from beginning to end. I think there was 5 volumes in total. I probably should have looked that up before filming this video, but I'm pretty sure there was 5. And this is another one that's had a Netflix adaptation. I haven't watched the Netflix adaptation, so I cannot speak to their similarities or dissimilarities, but I really need to. So let me know if you enjoyed that TV show and I will check it out, because I really liked this comic book series, and it was probably the comic book series that really got me onto horror as a comic book genre, and I love horror comic books and graphic novels now, so if you have any recommendations of those, also let me know. But it's about this family who have recently experienced tragedy and moving back to an old family like manor house where there are these keys that unlock secret doors, and there's dark secrets in these doors, and again high stakes and like other worlds and ghosts and creepiness. And I think because it's a comic book as well, it can really like amp up the frightening fear factor with the illustrations and the style that they're drawn in and the way that it brings characters' expressions and reactions to life and really visualises that for you. Would highly recommend Lock and Key, particularly if you don't read a lot of horror but you do like comic books and graphic novels and it's a genre that you might want to dabble in, so this might be a good like route into it. We then have one that I can't remember if it specifically gave me nightmares, but it's one of the sort of like creepy horror dystopian apocalyptic books that really unsettled me the most, because it probably plays on fears that really like burrow deep inside me. But not just that, it's also written beautifully, and like I said, I feel like there's something about horror with beautiful prose that brings it to life and really makes it effective. And this is sealed by Naomi Booth. So this is, I have to say, verging on the pandemic horror, so you may or may not want to read that at the moment, but it's very like specific. This is set in a like slightly futuristic version of our world, not particularly futuristic in its science or anything like that, but like a near future where this disease is spreading the globe, and this disease causes people's skin to seal over, thus the title. So your mouth might seal over, your eyes might seal over, your ears, your nose, what have you, and that can obviously lead to death. Say if like your nose and your mouth seal over, you can no longer breathe. But not only that, our main character is currently pregnant, and it's about how her paranoia and her fears surrounding her pregnancy, which she hadn't necessarily planned for, and how she's coping with that, and her decisions that she's made about her life, also in the wake of her mother passing, are gelling with the current climate and some people's reactions to this disease that's roving the globe, where they don't think it's very serious. She, however, is convinced that the government is hiding things from them, and we're never quite sure whether her paranoia is justified or not. And that is what I think is so fantastic about this book, that constant like, do we like go with where her mind is going, or is this just an escalation of her fears? Where does this all sit in this climate? And like I said, and then just at a very base level, I just think that whole idea of an illness that seals up your skin is really frightening. Like, I really don't like that image. But I like the way Naomi Booth writes, so I'm here for this book. We then have a book which I have to say actually has a very honest and excellent film adaptation, since we've mentioned some of the other adaptations of others in this video, and that is The Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey. Now, like I said, this is a film adaptation, and M.R. Carey actually wrote the film script as well, but this is a zombie book. And I've said it before, but I never used to think I was a zombie literature, zombie genre person, but this convinced me otherwise, because this is a phenomenal book. This is so good, and if you think you don't like zombies, I would give this a chance, because it might change your mind about what can be done with the zombie genre that is a little bit different, that's a little bit unique, that is a little bit more unexpected and twisty-turny. We follow a young girl who lives in this like futuristic, apocalyptic, dystopian world where there are zombies everywhere, and she is in a underground school with a bunch of other kids, all of whom are kept there, who are brought to their lessons every day but are otherwise kept in cells. And she's never known any other life. This is just like what she expects every day. She like knows her teachers and the guards on this compound, but she doesn't know anything else about the outside world or what's going on particularly, or what the world was like before any of this. And it's one of those horror novels that makes you question who are the monsters, and I love that whole theme. I think that's such an interesting sort of base for a book. It also draws on elements of the Pandora myth, which I love. I love anything that draws on classical mythology, and Pandora is one of my favourite myths, so that was like an excellent bit of sort of like Easter eggage in there, shall we say. And all in all, I just think this is such a compelling page turner of a novel that does not necessarily go in the directions you expect it to. We then have another 2020 read for me, and this one's actually quite a recent release as well, which is Ring Shout by P. Shelley Clark. So I'm a big fan of P. Shelley Clark's writing in general. They write a lot of like speculative SFF, alternative history work, and I really enjoy like what their imagination manages to conjure up, and this is one of those, but definitely falling into the horror category. It is an alternative history set in the early 1900s in the US, shortly after the release of the film Birth of a Nation. So Birth of a Nation is a real film. It was a film that was based on a book that basically was like KKK racist propaganda, and it was like a blockbuster hit. So it's all about the sort of immediate aftermath of this film's release, but in this alternative history we have a supernatural twist where the KKK are actually possessed by these monsters known as the Ku Kluxes. So the Klan are possessed by these monsters known as the Ku Kluxes, who are using this film to spread their hatred and their lust for violence into these people who already have a predilection for racism. So one of the things this book does not do is turn racism in the history of the Jim Crow era in America into like a simple like paranormal explain away. It's using this basically as a metaphor to explore the effects of that kind of like racist propaganda in that time period. And it is absolutely horrifying, but exactly in the way you would want it to be, and I think it's so clever, so like impactful and so beautifully written, so one I would highly recommend. Then lastly we have a book that I wouldn't say is like full on fear factor, I wouldn't say like it gave me nightmares, but it is definitely unsettling, and it's a bit of a classic, which is The Magician by W. Somerset Maugham. So W. Somerset Maugham was writing in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and this is a novel set in Paris during that time, following a group of friends who encounter this man who is a magician, and it's about the effect that he has on the young woman in this group who is meant to be in love with the young man in the group, but she starts to be drawn away first into herself and then to this magician, and it's simply his eerie control and manipulation and nefarious intentions that really bring the unsettling horror vibes to this book. I think it taps into a lot of really base fears and is done really well. Again, W. Somerset Maugham, fantastic writer. Love me some beautiful prose when it comes to my creepy literature, and this one definitely captures that. It's definitely one of the sort of earlier books I read that you might consider horror, although I wouldn't say like it's like terrifying, like keeps you up at night. It's just more unsettling and helped me establish what I'm interested in when it comes to horror. So I really enjoyed this book, and it's actually one that I read quite a few years ago now, like maybe 7 or so it would be good to return to and reread, because I always think about it, like when I think about this genre it pops into my mind, when I think about classics it pops into my mind, but it might be nice to have a little refresher and see how it reads 7 years later. So those are the 10 books I wanted to mention in this video. It was so hard to narrow down. There was a few that I kind of wanted to include as well. I might just quickly give honourable mentions here. There are 2 short story collections that if you like particularly horror in the format of short stories I would recommend, which are Tack to Me, an anthology of Arctic horror stories, which I've just not quite finished, and that was a reason I couldn't pop it in this video, because I've got a couple of stories still to read, and therefore I didn't feel like I could necessarily categorise it as a favourite, but so far I think is fantastic, and it's by lots of different authors, so it has lots of different types of horror in there. I also, for a short story collection written entirely by one author, love There Once Lived a Woman Who Tried to Kill Her Neighbour's Baby, Scary Fairy Tales by Ludmila Petrovskaya. Of course, the title kind of gives it away on this one. There are a bunch of creepy, unsettling, sometimes magic realism, sometimes not short stories, a little bit in the style of Roald Dahl's sort of adult short stories, and if I was to include some short story collections I would definitely mention those, as well as the Elia Whiteley one that I said at the beginning, and I will link them all down below in case you want more to check out. But otherwise I'm going to keep you here for hours, so I'm going to end things off there. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, got some recommendations for this season as well as the rest of the year if this is just the genre that you like to read, and I would love some more recommendations from you if you have any. So until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone.